already know me, I'm Luke Trumble, Supervisor of the State Dam Safety Program. I've been with the Dam Safety Program at DEQ, then DNRE, then DEQ, now EGLE for 14 years now, in the last 2.5 to 3 years as the supervisor of the program. And prior to that, I spent about 12 years as a regional engineer and permitted dozens of dam removal projects throughout the state. So I'm going to talk about some of my experiences and some of the things that you guys can expect when you're involved with a dam removal project or planning a dam removal project. Brief outline, I'm going to go over the dam safety program, just kind of some background information of who we are, what we do, some of the purposes of the dams, and some history on dams in the state, and talk about dam removal projects, both from permitting and reasons why and all things dam removal. Go over a few case studies, wrap it up, and then I think we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So if you have any questions, feel free to chime in and we'll address those at the end. So for history, Michigan's Dam Safety Program was established in the late 1970s. I think 1978 was the official date that created the Dam Safety Program. And it was following two major failures of dams out west. The Buffalo Creek and the Teton Dam failed out west, and that really sparked an interest in dam safety from a nationwide standpoint. And so the federal government established a national dam safety program, and states started to follow suit shortly after. It was originally housed in DNR's engineering division. We really didn't have much authority at that time. It was really just to permit construction of new dams. We had very little regulatory oversight of existing dams or any safety standards. And that all changed in 1989, at the end of 1989, when Public Act 300, or the Dam Safety Act, was established, and that gave us the authority over construction, alteration, removal of dams, and kind of set forth some safety requirements that dams must meet in order to be in compliance. And it did also provide an avenue for compliance and enforcement if dams were found to be out of compliance with the Dam Safety Act. That was slightly modified in 1994 and wrapped up into the NREPA, the Natural Resources Environmental Protection Act. So it's now known as Part 315 Dam Safety. In addition, we have Part 307, which is the inland lake levels statute, which is basically more commonly known as the legal lake level statute. So who we are in the Dam Safety Program. There's 7 of us, including myself, and these are my 6 staff. And I'll show you a coverage map. Allison Hartz, Thomas Horak, Mason Manuzak, Mike Size, Joy Stone, and Mitchell Thalen. 4 of them cover regions of the state, and we have a grants administrator and a kind of a centralized senior staff in Lansing. This is the coverage map. You'll see that Mike Size covers the UP and the northern portion of the Lower Peninsula. Thomas Horak covers Southwest, including Grand Rapids and Kalamazoo districts. Joy Stone covers the Lansing and Thumb and Saginaw Bay area, which is the Bay City District Office and Lansing District Office. And Allison Hartz covers the southeast portion of the state, which is the Jackson and Warren District offices. With Mitchell Thalen, he has kind of statewide coverage, and not shown on this map, but also very vital to what we do is Mason Manuzak, and his primary function is our grants administrator, grants coordinator for the Dam Risk Reduction Grant Program, which was implemented last year. So that's kind of the staff. What we needed to understand: what is a dam and what do we regulate? So the Part 315 dam safety definition, and I'm not going to read it, but it's basically an artificial barrier that is 6 feet high and impounds at least 5 acres of water. So there are smaller dams that don't meet those size criteria that are not regulated under dam safety, but are still dams, but pose less of a risk and create less of a barrier than these, which meet the size criteria under Part 315. And here's a brief overview of the dams that we have in the inventory in Michigan. There's over 2,600 dams that we know about, and several more that we don't know about. Each blue dot on the map on the right is a location of a known dam. You can see that there's pretty heavy concentration of dams in Southeast Michigan and Southwest Michigan. And then kind of as you go north, there's still a lot of dams. There's dams in every county, but the concentration kind of spreads out as you get into the more rural areas. Of those 2,600, approximately 825 are regulated under Part 315. Those are those ones that are 6 feet high and impound at least 5 acres. Another 235 or so are regulated under Part 307, which is the inland lake levels statute, legal lake level structures. And then additional 92 federally regulated hydropower dams. So those ones are not regulated under dam safety by the state, but are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission as they produce hydropower. So of those regulated dams, approximately 800 are privately owned and 350 are publicly owned. And the remaining 1,400 plus or minus dams that are in the inventory are unregulated, which means they do not meet the size criteria for Part 315 regulation. They do not have a legal lake level associated with them, and they're not regulated by FERC. So those are the smaller dams that don't meet the requirements of any of those statutes. Of all the dams that we have in the inventory, we have approximately 140 high hazard, 160 significant hazard. These are round, I'm just saying round numbers, and then another 2,300 low hazard potential dams. So hazard potential doesn't really have anything to do with the likelihood of failure or what the condition of the dam is. It has to do with if the dam were to fail, what would be the consequences of that failure. So high hazard potential dam means that if it were to fail, the flooding and the environmental impacts would be such that we could have potential loss of life. There'd be significant environmental degradation and economic impacts and flooding of structures, things like that. Significant hazard is below that, where it could impact occupied structures, but would not likely cause loss of life, and the environmental and economic impacts would be slightly less. And those low hazard dams are the ones that, if they were to fail, the flooding would impact unoccupied buildings, farm fields, local roads, things like that, where the environmental and economic impacts would be low, and loss of life, threat of loss of life would be almost non-existent. So we have a map, interactive map. I think we're going to share these slides afterwards, so you can follow this link and go to an interactive map and kind of see some more information about the individual dams if you're interested. So when most people think of a dam, this is kind of what pops into their mind. A concrete spillway structure, potentially a powerhouse, but a large concrete structure with gates, and but there are several different types of dams. Other than what comes to mind, this is a concrete gravity dam. It's basically where the concrete structure spans from bank to bank, and the mass of the concrete itself holds the dam in place and holds the water back. There is no earthen portion of the dam. More likely what you see in Michigan is something like this, where you have a large earthen embankment, and then you might have concrete or steel portions of the dam that convey water. With this one has a primary outlet as the house looking structure in the center of the photo, with the conduits through the dam with the outlets, and then a overflow spillway or an emergency spillway at the end, which is shown on the left of the photo. These are kind of the primary parts of a dam. The earthen embankment, it has an upstream slope, a downstream slope, and a crest, where it meets the adjacent land or the adjacent grades, that's called the groin. And then you typically have a principal spillway, which conveys base flows and up to a certain level of flood, with a conduit and an outlet, that passes through the dam. And then for very large floods, you have an emergency or an auxiliary spillway. This is one configuration where If the pond level gets very high and it exceeds the capacity of the principal spillway, then water will flow through the emergency spillway until the storm has passed and the water levels recede and the flows recede. This is just a cross section through the embankment, a typical cross section where it shows that drop inlet, principal spillway riser, the conduit, that goes through or underneath the embankment, and then the outlet structure. A lot of times dams will have a clay core, an impervious core with seepage cut off, which could be steel, sheet piling, could be clay, could be concrete, could be a bentonite slurry. And oftentimes they'll have a downstream filter and drain system, which kind of collects the seepage that does make it through the impervious core and discharges that in a safe manner, rather than having it express out on the slopes of the dam and create slope stability issues. So that's what a dam is. So what do we do? How do we regulate dams? So we, like I mentioned earlier, we administer Part 307, which is the inland lake level statute. And that basically sets forth a process for folks to be able to establish a legal lake level on their lake that must be maintained. In doing so, they typically set up a special assessment district so that taxes from that special assessment district can fund the long-term ongoing operation and maintenance costs, repair, replacement costs of the dam that maintains that lake level. Under the statute, the counties typically take over authority over the dam, and they are required to have an engineer inspect their dams every 3 years. We would review those inspection reports and provide comments, on how the dam is being maintained, additional studies, repairs that are needed. And we do not issue permits under 307, but rather we do a plan and specification review and provide authorization for construction. And that typically happens alongside of permit reviews under other statutes that EGLE does administer. Part 315 is the other law that we administer. It's the dam safety statute. As I mentioned, it was used to be known as the Dam Safety Act, with PA 300, Public Act 300. But the statute now, Part 315, mandates inspection of regulated dams, and that happens every 3, 4, or 5 years, currently based on the hazard potential that we talked about earlier. High hazard potential dams are inspected every 3 years, significant every 4, low hazard potential structures every 5. It gives us the authority to enforce the statute and issue permits for dam related activities. It gives us, the statute also allows us to inspect municipally owned dams for free of charge if the municipality that owns the dam requests us to do so. For those folks who have their own consultant do the inspection of dams, we review those and provide comment. High and significant hazard potential dams are required to complete and maintain an emergency action plan, which basically outlines the procedures and responses if a dam failure or something that threatens the dam were to occur. And then we can take enforcement actions when the dams are out of compliance. So some of the things that we issue permits for, actually this is out of line, but this is kind of where we fit into the grand scheme of the Water Resources Division assumed 404 regulatory assumption. So, we have lakes and streams and wetlands, and then we have dams, and they're all kind of interconnected. Dams are kind of at the outlet of the lake. So a lot of the permitting considerations that we have also dovetail right in with floodplains, wetlands, inland lakes and streams, and some of those areas that would include permitted activity under Water Resources Division permitted activities. So it's very, very infrequent that we would issue a permit at a dam that also didn't require review under those other statutes that affect wetland streams, floodplains, and things like that. So some of the things that we do issue permits for: construction of a new dam, alteration or repair of an existing dam, enlargement of a dam or an embankment, or impoundment, I should say, and removals of dams. Abandonment of dam is something that's very infrequent, but if it were to occur, we would have to issue a permit for that, and then reconstruction of a failed dam. And we're getting less and less permit applications for new dam construction. I've got a slide later on. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's very difficult to permit new construction of new dams when they're on a stream, just based on the environmental impacts and the potential flooding impacts and things like that. So we've only had, I think in my tenure, I permitted one new dam in 14 years on a stream, a few more that were off stream, like water resource or water supply reservoirs and things like that. But very, very few applications come in for new dam construction, and it's been that way for quite a while. And I'll show a slide later. So these are just some photos. You know, construction of a new dam obviously would require a permit under Part 315. Enlargement, it's hard to see from here, but these plans show a raising of the embankment and of the impoundment near the top in those dotted lines. Reconstruction of a failed dam. After a dam fails and folks wish to reconstruct it and restore the impoundment, that obviously requires a permit under dam safety and several other statutes as well. And removal of a dam, you know, when somebody wants to physically remove the dam and remove the dam and the impoundment and restore a stream channel, that obviously requires a permit to do so. So taking a step back, we can look at why do we have dams in the first place? What are some of the historic and current uses of dams, and why did we historically construct dams? Dams before hydropower, hydroelectric power, I should say, a lot of dams provided mechanical power for, you know, grist mills, sawmills, things like that, to cut lumber, to grind flour, to float logs, things like that. That was kind of one of the first purposes of dams in Michigan, was to modify the stream to use the power of the water to perform some type of task that folks need. So there still are a few mechanical power dams around, but those are less and less these days. There's hydropower. A lot of dams were constructed as hydropower, or mechanical power dams were converted to hydroelectric power after they were built. So there are still several. Like I said, there's 92 regulated hydropower dams. And there's a couple more hydropower dams in the state that are exempt from federal regulation, that are regulated by the state. But so around 100, I'd say, total in the state, operating hydropower dams, the ones that generate hydroelectricity. Navigation, obviously, locks and dams, and augmenting of streams and lakes to allow for better navigation has been a historic and current use of dams. Lake level control and recreation. I would say this is probably the most prevalent now, is just augmenting a lake level or maintaining a lake level for the purpose of maintaining a recreational impoundment, where folks live and play and boat and fish in and around the water, right? So I think that's probably the primary purpose of dams in the state of Michigan now. Water supply, fire suppression. I don't think I included a slide. Flood control. There's actually not very many dams in the state that are designed to provide flood control. We have 13 federally designed for the purpose of flood control. Some other smaller dams and detention basin dams will provide flood control up to a certain flood. But most of the dams that you see that maintain a recreational lake, because the pond is full most of the time, provide very little flood control benefit during a large flood. There might provide some during smaller floods, but there's just no capacity to store and slowly meter out water over time if the pond is already full. So very few dams were designed for flood control in the state of Michigan, or operating for flood control when you look at the whole. And one that I didn't mention on here, but probably is pertinent to this group, is we also have several smaller dams that provide like wildlife floodings, wetland mitigation sites, or just provide some type of wetland benefit from creating a shallower, less developed impoundment. So we have all these dams. There's 2,600 in the inventory. There's probably hundreds more that we are finding every year, or that exist that we are either too small to show up on a map, or remotely located. They're not in the public eye, so we don't know about them. So why do we remove dams? The number one reason is that safety. the dam is getting old. It's not been maintained, and the dam maintenance of a dam is very expensive. So we're worried that there's a safety concern that the dam is going to fail if something isn't done. And often the most economically viable path forward is to remove the dam. And we'll talk about benefits here in a couple of slides as well. But so there, along with the safety comes ownership responsibilities and liabilities. If the dam were to fail, a release of impounded water and sediment were to occur, there's a certain amount of responsibility and liability that lies with the dam owners that they might not want to maintain anymore. So as dams get older, the increased cost of maintenance and repair can be a deciding factor. Some folks can squeak by on just doing minor repairs and interim repairs to extend the life of a dam, but at some point, concrete and steel wear out, and we have to start talking about major rehabilitation or replacement, and those costs can get very, very large. And sometimes dam owners do not have the means to be able to do that. So as the maintenance and repair costs go up, the viability of removal from an economic standpoint start to make a lot more sense. Kind of dovetailing into that inadequate funding and deferred maintenance, like we said, once those costs get above the means of the dam owner to incur, a lot of times we have to start to shift the conversation to different ownership of the dam or removal of the dam. A lot of dams have outlived their useful lifespan. Typical design life of a dam, the components of a dam are, when they're from brand new, are 50 to 100 years, depending on what the material and the construction is. So a lot of the dams in the state, as we'll see here in a couple slides, have outlived that useful life. So we're not talking about repair anymore. We're talking about full rehabilitation or replacement, which is very, very expensive. Sometimes dams are removed as part of a compliance action. If there are provisions in the dam safety statute that allow the department to pursue dam removal as a way to eliminate hazard and environmental impacts associated with the ongoing existence and operation of that dam. So sometimes we order dams to be removed because that's the best solution, and the owner is not doing the things they need to be doing. So and then a lot of times this occurs too is where they're no longer serving their original purpose. As I said, a lot of dams were originally designed to aid in logging, to provide power to a sawmill, or to provide power to a grist mill, or some other type of function that once the grid was, once we electrified the state and the primary source of electrical power is no longer hydroelectricity, they don't serve that purpose anymore. And so unless the impoundment has kind of been built up as a recreational impoundment, a lot of times we have, impoundments, dams that pose some level of hazard aren't being maintained and don't really provide a whole lot of benefit in their impoundment. So if they're no longer serving a useful purpose, removal often comes to the forefront as a preferred alternative moving forward. This is the slide I talked about earlier. You can see, there were a few dams being built in the 1800s. Those were most of your small mill type dams, to provide that mechanical power. Around the turn of the century, we see it start to ramp up significantly. In the early 1900s, we jump into the, above 65 to 100 or 125 dams per year. And then, from the 50s through the 70s, there was a huge spike in dam construction. And this kind of mirrors, kind of the national trend as well. So around that time, there was a lot of public works projects and industrial expansion, and dams were kind of the flavor of the day. We built almost, in the 1960s, there's almost 500 dams built in the state of Michigan. And that's, you can see it sharply drop off in the 80s and 90s. And I don't have an updated figure, but it continues to go down from there, to those previous levels of less than 5, maybe 1 a year or something like that now in the early 2000s and 2010s, 2020s. So as you can see, there, from the peak in the 60s and maybe 70s, that puts the dams right in that getting towards the end or, surpassing their useful design life. So, for all the dams that are 50 years old or older, we're probably, unless there's been routine maintenance that extend the life of the dam, we're probably talking about very significant, significant investment to maintain that dam in a safe condition, which would be, full rehabilitation or replacement of the structures. So I think that's why if you had a figure that said, dam removal history in Michigan, I bet you would mirror this, where it was probably very low and then it's probably trending up. I don't know if we'll ever see 500 dam removals in a year, but we've seen, kind of a continued increase from the 90s, early 2000s, and now. And I think we average between 5 and 6 dam removals per year. And I think we're going to continue to see that trend increase. So here's some of the benefits, social economic benefits of dam removal. As we kind of talked about earlier, it eliminates the hazard associated with dam failure. So if you remove a dam, it no longer holds back water and sediment that could be released in the event of a failure that could cause all these downstream impacts and upstream impacts that we'd be concerned about. You eliminate your long-term operation and maintenance costs. Typically when a dam is removed and the stream channel is restored, it should be stable and should not require a lot of ongoing maintenance. And so the cost to maintain should go way down. It reduces upstream flooding in a lot of cases, where if you're holding the water level artificially high, as flood flows increase, areas that are outside of the impoundment could flood. If you take the dam out, that water level drops significantly, and typically those areas no longer flood during the same storm event. And then you restore the natural flood storage and attenuation that's provided in adjacent wetlands and floodplains that were underwater while the dam was in place. Ecosystem benefits: you improve the movement of biota, aquatic and terrestrial biota upstream and down. Improve riverine habitat for spawning and other things, and foraging, things like that. Restore the natural flow regime and sediment transport, what helps all of that, improve habitat quality, things like that. Water quality, we eliminate the thermal pollution that happens as water warms and impoundments. We get increased DO and decreased biological oxygen demand, things like that. So we improve nutrient cycling and movement, restore the natural channel morphology. So the ability for the channel to kind of adjust to different flow patterns and things like that, and move sediment through the system such that we kind of reach a dynamic equilibrium where we don't have impounded sediment or erosion as much occurring in the stream system. And this is a figure I stole from DNR, but it's kind of the negative impacts of dam. You can see that, dams block fish passage, they block sediment transport, they block debris and nutrient transport, and you get a lot of warming. The temperature of the surface water increases behind the dam. So if it's a cool or cold water stream, that could definitely have impacts downstream or where that warm water is being discharged from the dam. Here's the more benefits, increased spawning habitat, passage, cooler temperatures, natural flow regimes, things like that I already talked about. And then, so I'm going to switch gears a little bit and go to more of permitting of dam removal projects. And I just wanted to be upfront that dam removal projects are complicated. They have a lot of moving parts, a lot of statutes that we administer here in Water Resources Division. And then there's some other statutes that are outside of our purview in Water Resources Division, but still housed within EGLE. And I drew this diagram. This is a Brown Bridge Dam prior to removal up on the Boardman River in near Traverse City. And I just kind of outlined some concerns here. The dam itself is regulated under Part 315. So that's kind of the red outline. Everything below the ordinary high water mark, kind of the blue outline, is regulated under Part 301, which is the Inland Lakes and Stream Statute. Then the green areas, I said, those are typically, regulated wetlands under 303, but also I put Part 201, which is it's administered by Remediation Redevelopment Division. and it has to do with soil cleanup criteria. So direct human contact on soils, so once this is a partially drawn down scenario where the impoundment was lowered several feet, and it exposed a lot of areas that used to be sediment that was underwater, now is soils that are subject to direct human contact. So there's different cleanup criteria, for those soils. This is another picture from the same project during the removal. We've got Part 31 floodplain. We'll have to do review of the hydraulics of the floodplain, conveyance of water, placement of fill, and excavation in the floodplain and floodway. There's Part 31 water quality concerns. Obviously, there's a lot of sediment mobility and turbidity that occurs when you dewater a channel and start to move sediment again. There's channel design. We want to do an in-depth review of what that stream channel and the floodplains and the stability and the morphology of the stream will look like. Part 115, that's has related to solid waste under our materials management division. Administers Part 115 and Part 111, which are related to solid waste and hazardous waste, respectively. Anytime you start dredging sediment, if it's not designated as inert, it becomes a regulated waste, and you have to handle it, dispose of it, or store it in accordance with that statute as well. SHPO, State Historic Preservation Office, there's, oftentimes these areas around dams or in former impoundment areas have some type of cultural significance. They have potential areas of artifacts have been found. The dam structure itself might have some historical relevance. So there's definitely a SHPO component. T&E, there could be T&E, so threatened and endangered animal species or plant species often occur in the wetlands that surround the wetlands and forested areas that surround the impoundment, or it might reform, in the areas of the impoundment that are exposed. And there's several other concerns, that might arise on a case-by-case basis. So that's just kind of an intro. These things can get very complicated. A lot of stakeholders, a lot of coordination that needs to occur, a lot of considerations that need to be made, and requirements that need to be met at multiple levels, state, local, federal levels. So what do we review on our end when we get a permit application for a dam removal? So obviously we talked a lot about Part 315 dam safety. That's mostly, the key components that we look at there are the safety, watering, and physical removal of the dam. So once the dam barrier is eliminated and it's no longer maintaining head, the dam safety component is more or less satisfied, right? The strictly engineering behind safe removal and dewatering of the impoundment. So, but in doing so, there's alteration of water levels, there's grading below the ordinary high water mark, there's stream restoration and channel design that all need to be reviewed under Part 301 in lakes and streams to ensure that impairment of the stream and habitat and all the animals that use the stream are acceptable, so that an impairment doesn't occur. When we lower surface water, there's a lot of adjacent wetlands that will be impacted by the drawdown. Then there are also a bunch of grading in areas that are wetlands or might reform as wetlands. We have to ensure that that is done in such a way that existing or impacts to existing and dam or wetlands that will persist will be avoided and minimized, and that we maximize the establishment of new wetlands, when the water level is lowered and those areas that were previously underwater are exposed. That's under Part 303 wetlands protection. Part 31 floodplains. So Part 31 is a large law under water resources protection. There's floodplain sections, there's water quality sections, there's a bunch more in there. But Part 31 floodplain provisions or floodplain authorities kind of focus in on the grading and structures in the floodplains and floodway, and they focus more on conveyance of flow. So we can't do anything that would increase flooding on people's properties or homes. Typically, that's not a concern with dam removal projects. Typically, we're reducing upstream flood elevations, but depending on what type of grade control structures are in place. There could be localized increases if we go downstream of where the dam was and put grade control in. If we go up to the upstream extent of where the impoundment was, there is a chance that we could increase flooding locally. So we want to have a good grasp of that and make sure that that's not going to impact any regulated structures or insured structures. Part 31, water quality, that looks more at the dredging and mobilization of sediment. Both from a turbidity and sediment mobilization, like a quantity, how much sediment will move off site and impact downstream areas, but also what's the quality of that sediment? What's going to be exposed, mobilized, or disturbed during construction, that if it has any level of contamination, what would that do to the aquatic biota? What ecological impacts will that have on the stream? So that's all kind of regulated under Part 31 water quality. I mentioned earlier Part 201, that's basically exposure of sediment as soils or on-site placement of dredge spoils, which would be subject to direct human contact. So things that were once underwater and not a pathway for direct human contact or prolonged direct human contact, those need to be reevaluated once they become upland soils or terrestrial soils that people can have more access to. So there's criteria for that as well. So there'll be some sampling and analysis of sediment quality to determine what impacts that might have. I mentioned earlier Part 111, Part 115, which are directly related to dredging and handling and disposal of sediment as waste. It's a generated waste that must be handled and disposed of appropriately in accordance with the level of contamination that's in the sediments. Threatened endangered species of special interest. We take a look at that from the state perspective, involve the feds, for federally listed species as well. If there are direct impacts to species or habitat or adjacent habitat that might be impacted by the dam removal project, we have to understand what potential impacts that has on the threatened and endangered species and species of special interest. SHPO we mentioned earlier, as far as cultural significance, cultural relevance, artifacts, or structures that have historic relevance as well. And then tribes are often very interested in dam removal projects and want to ensure that those same areas of cultural significance are protected, and that the dam removal will provide benefit to those important areas. So a little bit more information about what's required. So we're kind of getting into the name of the presentation was facilitating dam removal projects, facilitating permitting of dam removal projects, right? So we're going to get a little bit into the weeds about what is required in a permit application for dam removal. And it's got multiple statutes that we look at and multiple pieces of information and documentation that need to be provided, kind of commensurate with the complexity of the project. So smaller dams where some of these things are not as huge of a concern, we can scale back a little bit. But the larger dams that are in some of the case studies with large impoundments, bigger streams, they often require a lot of information to be submitted with the permit application. So strictly speaking about Part 315 dam safety, there's the joint permit application form needs to be filled out with the relevant dam and spillway section filled out. That will have blanks that need to be filled in about the dam, the size of the dam, the quantity of cut and fill along the dam embankment, lowering of the water, how far the water would be lowered, and stuff like that. We need site plan specification and basis of design report typically to review. So we need to understand how the dam will be removed, how water, will pass through. That's more in the dewatering plan, but the care water type during construction, both stormwater and conveyance of flow in the stream. And we need to see the basis of design. We need to see what calculations, modeling, analyses were run to come up with the design to ensure that it's safe, that we don't have failures pre, during, or post construction that would release result in an uncontrolled release of sediment or water. Dewatering plan, obviously we need to understand how the water is going to be drawn down, how it's going to be controlled, what the rates are, what type of monitoring is going to go on. The means and methods of removal. Certain types of removal, are more impactful than others. If you do a lot of concentrated concrete cutting, that generates a lot of effluent that can raise pH significantly and cause water quality concerns. So a lot of times, if you're going to do concentrated concrete sawing or cutting, a lot of times that effluent needs to be collected and filtered or discharged away from the stream so that it doesn't cause those issues. There's other types of, demolition that don't generate that same concern. Hydraulic analysis, we need to understand how the dam conveys flow and how the restored stream section will convey that same flow, just to ensure that flood flows, enough of the dam is removed and that the channel is adequate to pass those same flood flows without causing concerns. Sediment quantity and quality, and management of that sediment. So dams act as a sediment trap, and sometimes they're in place for hundreds of years. They can trap hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of sediment for some of the bigger dams, and that needs to be characterized and managed appropriately. And then there's a project assessment. So it's defined in statute and in rule under Part 315 administrative rules. And a project assessment document needs to have an analysis of all this laundry list of things. And so wetlands, streams, fisheries, wildlife, threatened and endangered species, water quality, stream flows, sediment transport, turbidity, water chemistry, water temperature, and riparian rights. So in the project assessment document, we need to understand all the positive and negative impacts on each one of these categories related to the dam removal and mitigative strategies when required. So some of these, will be a clear improvement, right? But some of these, could have a dam removal could have some impact on wetlands or things like that might require mitigation if the project is carried out in a certain way. So we just need to have an assessment of the positive and negative impacts and mitigative strategies where required. So jumping to Part 301 in lakes and streams, same thing, the joint permit application has sections for in lakes and streams, cut and fill, below ordinary high water mark, things like that, structures to be erected on bottomlands, things like that, channel design. Site plan specification based design is going to be a constant theme for a lot of these. Feasible and prudent alternatives analysis. This is a big one, right? Where when you're looking at the different ways to remove a dam and restore the channel, we specifically need to see that impacts to aquatic resources are avoided, minimized, and then mitigated. So in that order. So looking at different sizes, configurations, locations, for fills or for spoils placement, other things like that, that would generate less amount of impact and still achieve the project purpose, were required by law to ensure that the designers have considered that, and that they are choosing an alternative that avoids and minimizes impacts first, and then mitigates for any unavoidable impacts. A big one also is the drawdown plan, and related to how quickly the water is going to be drawn down. Will that generate a lot of turbidity or sediment transport? Will it, cause instability or flood flows downstream? And a big one that we have to consider as well is stranded organisms, mussels and fish and other organisms that use those impoundments need to be sometimes an assessment beforehand and relocated to areas of adequate depth during and after drawdown and removal. So that needs to be part of the drawdown plan. Channel design, that's a big component as well. We need to understand the morphology, how the stream will form and move sediment and other materials through. A lot of it has to do with stability in the long term and ability to have access to a floodplain at appropriate flows and things like that. But another one that's kind of newer is kind of the measuring tool, which is the functional the SQT, the stream quantification tool, which kind of measures the functional lift of a project that a project will have on the stream. So we are asking these days for folks to do a stream quantification tool assessment and see it, kind of understand what the function of a stream is under the impounded condition, which is, you know, definitely impaired typically, and then what it will be post-project to show that that some benefit will be derived from the dam removal. And then just here as a last note on part 301, there is a minor project category, category number 49 for small dam removal. And that's for dams that are less than 2 feet high, or 2 feet or less high, and impound less than 2 acres of water. For those, the requirements for permit application design are quite a bit less than something, say that was regulated under 315, or was a larger dam that has, you know, more head, impounds a lot more water and sediment. So there is an MP. So if you have a dam that you'd like to remove that's, you know, 2 feet high and impounds makes a small impoundment, talk with your district staff at EGLE about the possibility of permitting it as a minor project. Part 303 is the wetland statute. Same, you know, I'm going to go through kind of quickly, you know, same thing here. Joint permit application sections filled out, plans, specifications based on design, feasible and prudent alternatives. This is more related to your grading and your placement of fill and things like that. Have you avoided impacts to existing wetlands? Have you avoided impacts to areas that will reform as wetlands to the extent possible? And here you have reduce that footprint to the extent possible, and then provide mitigation where needed, if needed. So, and something here that we have a lot of conversation with, you know, wetland professionals and consultants about is what's needed for wetland delineation and analysis for dam removal. So typically, you know, we have to look at existing wetlands in the impounded condition, and then we have to do some analysis, or we have to be provided with some analysis of post drawdown and removal. What will be the areas that will remain as wetland? What areas will transition to upland? What areas will reform as wetland? You know, that were, you know, underwater and not submergent wetland. And then we have to try to avoid cut and fill in all the areas that would reform or persist as wetlands, or be prepared to mitigate for those fills. So this is sometimes a little bit difficult to do because we can't account for all the areas where surface water hydrology will remain, or I'm sorry, groundwater hydrology will remain at a higher elevation, you know, seeps and things that come out on slopes that might maintain a wetland post drawdown. So we have to have some analysis of this so that we can strategically place fill generated from channel restoration activities outside of areas that will remain or reform as wetlands. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, but that's to avoid having to mitigate in those areas. A wetland restoration plan for temporary impacts, haul roads, access roads, you know, other temporary grading to facilitate the dam removal and stream restoration for those areas that are going to be restored post-construction. We need to see a restoration plan for that. And here's the exemption. And it's under Part 303, also administrative rules. And it basically says that the basic project purpose is to restore the stream and wetlands to historic pre-dam condition, then wetland mitigation is not required. Any other fill dredging, et cetera, to the wetlands that will be restored or remain post-dam removal will require mitigation. So, so read through that, you know, read through those exemptions and keep that in mind if you're doing design or consideration. That's why we really have to have a good wetland delineation and estimate of what areas will remain or reform as wetlands, such that we can avoid placing fill there, so that we can avoid having to require mitigation in those areas, and encourage the most reformation and persistence of wetland areas as possible. And some of these will be a net positive, some of them will be a net negative based on, you know, the valley type and how much area gets exposed and what the hydrology looks like post removal. But so we really have to kind of cue on this, and it's a case-by-case review. Part 31, floodplain considerations. Obviously, joint permit application, plan specs. We need to understand the cut and fill in the floodway structures and the floodplain and floodway. I see there's a typo there, so we'll have to correct that. Hydraulic model and report. So if you look at the Part 31 hydraulic report guidelines, sometimes dam removals require a hydraulic model, sometimes they don't. And it's typically dependent on what type, if you're going to put in-stream structures in, J-hooks, riffles, cross veins, any other type of in-stream grade control structure that might impact localized flooding, and not, if it's not clear cut that this removal will produce reduction in flood elevations. And through that, when a hydraulic model report or otherwise, there has to be an analysis of harmful interference, which means basically any increase in flooding or velocities on structures that are insurable. So people's properties, garages, houses, things like that are insurable, that would have an increased flooding or flood velocities could be a harmful interference. So we need to understand that the project won't cause that in order for it to be permittable under Part 31. And I put in here as a note, a LOMAR, a letter of map revision. Typically, if the community in which a dam exists is participating in the FEMA National Flood Insurance Program, it's responsibility of the community to provide FEMA with the information and changes in hydraulic conditions and things like that, the modeling and the maps for what the revised floodplain will be, such that they can incorporate that into a letter of map revision and change those elevations, which they regulate where people are in and out of the floodplain, need to have flood insurance, things like that. So it's a responsibility of the community that participates in that program to provide that information to FEMA, and it generally comes from the project, right? So the designers on the project will supply the information to the community to submit the application so that they can make those changes and make sure that the folks that are in the floodplain post-project or out of the floodplain post-project are accounted for. Water quality concerns, same stuff. What we really hone in on here is the volume of sediment available in the impoundment to mobilize. And then we'll have to do sampling and chemical analysis of those sediments typically in accordance with WRD Procedure 48, which is a procedure for dredge sediments. That's if it's a relatively small volume of sediment. If we have some of these larger impoundments that have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of cubic yards of sediment that could be mobilized, typically we have to do more of like a remedial investigation type approach, where it's a lot more sampling and analysis of the sediment quantity and quality outside of what was contemplated in Procedure 48, which was more small dredge projects. But we apply basically the same criteria on sample locations and size and depths and numbers to testing analytes to understand to characterize the chemical properties of the sediment that's in the impoundment that could be dredged, could be mobilized, or could be exposed by the project. So typically that involves cores to project depth, plus I put plus 6 inches here because we want to know what the material under the project depth would be that would be exposed to the water that's currently under sediment. And then a lot of times what folks will do is a grain size analysis on the front end, because if the sediment makeup is more than 90% sand or larger particles, then we don't require chemical analysis. So it's the fine grain particles that we're worried about mostly. A sediment management plan and post project monitoring. So if you have a large volume of sediment that would mobilize, and that's too much for the stream to handle, or if it's contaminated, there needs to be some type of active management typically, and post-project monitoring so that we understand how much sediment is moving off-site, if that's problematic to the stream, and how the sediment is mobilizing over time, and if it's causing any problems. Part 201, which is the kind of the soil cleanup criteria, a lot of the same things. What they would need to see here is there are really maps of areas that are currently underwater that would be exposed for drawdown. And then if there's, the same criteria for if dredged sediment is proposed for on-site disposal, locations of that, from where it's being dredged from, where it's being placed. And then typically there's some sampling and chemical analysis. They typically utilize a different sampling approach where they're doing more of a gridded approach and only going down a certain depth to kind of get the average contamination of that top layer of soil. And would that, and that's inconsistent with what we talked about earlier with the two project depth cores, so there might be some inconsistency there that might require follow-up sampling after drawdown. But anyway, basically we're trying to determine whether or not the soils that will be exposed, that people will be subject to direct human contact, will be exposed post drawdown and removal or placed on uplands adjacent, whether those will create a facility under Part 201 and require something like a due care, which would be, it's dependent on land use and criteria for the amount of exposure that people will have to that material. Part 115, 111, it's basically the dredge spoils. There's three characterizations from worst to best. Hazardous waste, that's if the contamination is so high that it basically is not suitable for anything but disposal in a hazardous waste landfill. Then there's solid waste, where it's a regulated solid waste. It exceeds some criteria, but it isn't so bad that it needs to go to hazardous waste. It can be landfilled in a standard, type 2 landfill, or potentially stored on site with some restrictions, or it can get what's called an inertness designation, where the contamination level does not exceed certain criteria, and it can basically be used on site without restriction. And it just so these statutes kind of just regulate the dredging, the handling, and the disposal. Threatened and endangered species, species of special interest. So what we'll do is on our end, we'll put a buffer area around the project. And if we find occurrences of federally listed T&E in the project area, we do like a red file review, which is where we involve the federal agencies and consult with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to understand what the impacts to federally listed T&E species might be. We also bring in our EGLE and DNR experts to chime in on state listed and state special interest species for the same type of review. I would say the most common occurrences in dam removals are federally listed mussels, state or federally listed mussels in the impoundment or below the dam. Bats, range widely in the state. So typically with clearing of trees associated with the project, we'll have concerns about state and federally listed bats or federally listed bats. Eastern Massasauga rattlesnake typically utilize the areas adjacent to impoundments and dams. So there's a lot of times considerations for timing of drawdown and impacts in areas where they might inhabit. Less common occurrences, we have had, birds and butterflies trigger a T&E hit that we have to have special considerations for, increases in flooding at certain times of year or lowering of water levels, certain things like that. When critical periods in their life cycle as well. And then we also have sometimes, rare and imperiled habitats, rare and imperiled wetland habitats, things like that like to live around dam impoundments and might be impacted if we have negatively impacted during construction or positively impacted if those areas expand during drawdown and removal. So another consideration. SHPO, as I talked about before, historic buildings and structures, archaeological sites, areas of cultural significance. If we find these areas within the buffer area of the project, we would engage with the State Historic Preservation Office right away. The most common occurrences that we deal with typically are dams or bridges have some historical relevance or on the historical registry. In that case, typically if there's safety concerns, it will not prevent removal of the dam, but might require preservation of a portion of the structure or a monument or something to be put up to maintain that relevance. If artifacts are found in the area, might require special considerations during excavation, even having archaeologists on site during excavation so they can kind of direct the digs and react accordingly if artifacts are found. But like I said, generally this will not prevent removal of dams. There'll be special, considerations and concerns, during the removal and maybe some preservation efforts post removal. But we're not in the habit of preserving failing dams and presenting, public health and safety risk if the structure would not need to be retained for those typically. Tribal involvement. Tribes are often interested in dam removal projects. So if we think that tribes might be interested, we'll work with our EGLE WD tribal liaison early on to kind of engage with the tribes to start the consultation process. Like I said earlier, tribes are typically supportive of dam removals because it restores some of those areas that they used historically for fishing, hunting, foraging, gathering, in past. But there might be some concerns, excavation in areas of cultural significance. There might be wild rice beds that are in the floodplains of the impoundment or the stream that they'd want to see preserved. There might be other concerns, it's kind of a case by case, but so definitely we want to include tribes early and understand what those concerns are and design the project in a way that either preserves or avoids impacts in those areas of concerns. All right, so I think that's mostly very, high level, major concerns, kind of a reoccurring occurrences of, things that come up during dam removal, during permitting at the state and federal level. So I want to look at a couple case studies of larger dam removals where wetlands and other issues became, were kind of themes that took a lot of consideration. So the first one is the Niles Dam. Most people refer to it as the Pucker Street Dam because it went right adjacent to Pucker Street. It was constructed in 1928. The current, the dam that was recently removed, there was a dam before that, but the existing structure that was removed in 2020, 2021 was built in 1928. It's 38 feet high, and it was constructed for hydroelectric generation. There was issues with settling of the powerhouse and condition of the dam that prompted the city of Niles to abandon hydroelectric generation in the 1990s. And then the dam posed a significant hazard potential. So it was kind of parkland and some inhabited structures downstream, but loss of life was not likely if the dam were to fail, but still a pretty significant safety concern because it was pretty heavily fished in that area. Following decommissioning of the powerhouse, the city actually drew down the impoundment in 1998 and kind of ran afoul with a huge sediment release. So there was a large volume of sediment that mobilized in 1998 when the impoundment was drawn down. So it's kind of held there for several years. Again, in 2008, September 2008, there was a large flood that went through Southwest Michigan and almost caused failure of the dam. So that kind of prompted the city to say, we can't just let this thing sit here like it is. We need to do something, and they started pursuing removal, and it took a long time, but to get the funding together and the design done. But in 2020, 2021, physical removal of the structure and restoration of the Dowagiac River started and was completed in 2021. And it overall reconnected 159 miles of high gradient cold water stream of the Dowagiac River and its tributaries to the St. Joseph River. So it was a huge priority from a fisheries perspective, and one that we love to have checked off because it was a significant hazard dam that wasn't in good shape and had almost failed previously. So here's some historic aerials. Bottom right is kind of the dam and the drawn down condition prior to removal. You can see the gates are up out of the water, so it's drawn down kind of to the concrete spillway crest. Historically, the water was about 6 or 8 feet higher than that. The picture on the left is kind of a historic aerial that shows kind of the impoundment at full pool. You can see sedimentation at the top where there's a lot of deltas and mid-channel bars forming, up where it says Creek Road and Dowagiac River. On the right, that's kind of the same location post 1998 drawdown. So you can see a lot of the areas that were formerly underwater were exposed, and the river channels kind of braided and coming through those impounded sediments. Here's a picture on the left of post-removal. So you can see a lot of those areas that were exposed are now becoming vegetated as floodplain and banks. The dam is fully removed. The picture on the right is a zoomed in photo of the grade control structure that was placed at the dam, the kind of a rock riffle where the dam used to be. And this is during construction, but at the final stages of construction. So you can see the progression here. There were some issues, right? There was a lot of sedimentation in this impoundment. It had been in place for nearly 100 years, and a lot of sand and sediment had built up in the impoundment. And that needed to be excavated or mobilized, to restore the stream channel and floodplains. But this was a fairly steep gradient stream and fairly narrow valley. So there was very limited areas to dispose of those sediments in areas that weren't going to be wetlands. So, and on top of that, there was a lot of groundwater inputs throughout the impoundment where we expected wetlands to persist after the water level was fully lowered and the dam was drawn down. So I think that makes a difficult equation for avoiding those impacts, right? You either have to haul all the sediment off stream or out of offsite and to dispose of it somewhere, which can be very costly, or find a place kind of adjacent to place it. And that's ultimately what the solution was. The city purchased some adjacent land next to where the dam used to be, and they disposed of they were able to, have a very short haul distance from the project site and remove the bulk of the sediments that were generated for the stream restoration was placed in those upland areas adjacent to the dam. And so they avoided and minimized a lot of placement in areas that would have been wetland post removal. And for the balance where impacts were unavoidable, they did purchase some wetland mitigation credits so that they could mitigate for those areas that were impacted. I'll provide a link here if you want to look at more at that project. We'll go to the next one. The Boardman River dams. It's 3 dam removals and 1 dam reconstruction on the Boardman River up near Traverse City. A lot of this is borrowed from their website, so I'll provide a link at the end as well. But it's the largest dam removal and stream restoration project in Michigan. It was a 295 square mile watershed that was completely cut off, but it's basically been restored all the way to its headwaters in Kalkaska area. Removed 3 former hydropower dams, and then currently project is about ready to kick off to reconstruct the Union Street Dam, which is the lowest downstream barrier in Traverse City downtown. It restored 3.4 miles of the Boardman River stream and floodplain. That's direct reconstruction out through the impoundments, but reconnected over 161 miles of stream and tributaries. 250 acres of wetlands were restored or recreated, and about 60 acres of upland in the former impoundment areas. This is just a map of the Boardman River watershed with, kind of the fish species that existed before the dams. Then dams were installed, for hydropower, mechanical power, and logging. The logging industry was huge. So dams started to go up. Here's a history. I'm not going to go through it all, but there were several dams that were built. A few failed. And then, kind of in the early 2000s, Traverse City Light and Power surrendered their license to generate hydropower and started to look at long-term disposition of those dams. They were leased from the city and the county. So the city and the county were saying, hey, we have these hydropower dams that don't generate hydropower. What are we going to do? Ultimately, around 2005, 2006, the decision to remove the dam, 3 of the dams was made, and to modify the Union Street Dam was made. They started to lower the water level. So 2007 to 2011, the 3 upstream impoundments were lowered. In 2012 to 2018, the upper 3 dams were removed. And so these are the dams. Upstream, the furthest upstream was Brown Bridge. In the middle was Boardman. Next was Sabin, and then Union Street is right down Traverse City. This is a picture during the removal of the Boardman Dam, where this is that safe dewatering and stream restoration. So I think something like 14 36-inch siphons were used to pass the base flow, and then construction to draw down the water level as safely and as possible until the siphons become inefficient, and then they constructed a bypass channel and sedimentation basin to lower the head on the dam the remaining several feet. I'm going to speed up a little bit because I think we want to leave some time for question and answer. But there's pictures of active channel restoration, dredging and grading of the channel to place the spoils. The theme here is they piled them high and off to the side to avoid to minimize the footprint of spoil placement in areas that could be reforming as wetland. Here's what it looks like, post drawdown and removal, with a lot of bare areas, and this is pre-final grading, but this is what the final product looks like, where graded floodplains, native plantings, the spoil areas are kind of off to the side against the valley walls, and a lot of areas are graded to specifically return as wetland. So then some of the issues, it's a very, very large volume of sediment needed to be excavated to restore the stream channel and floodplains. There were seeps and tributary streams that came in that needed to be avoided. And there was a desire to keep some of the construction access roads as permanent paths for walking and things like that. So the solution, well, here was a little bit different, was to strategically pile the spoils, high into the side, was a term that we used, but it was in areas that were expected to transition to upland to avoid and minimize those impacts to areas that would persist or reform as wetlands. And then they relocated some of the access roads to areas that would be or were uplands so that they could keep them permanent and not have additional wetland impacts. The temporary access roads closer to the stream were then, removed typically and graded out so that they would be allowed to reform as wetland. And then they actually, in the floodplains, they did a little micro topography to encourage formation of different wetland features to encourage the formation of wetlands to the extent possible in the newly graded floodplains. And here's the link to that project if you want more information. Okay, so that was a lot, but wrapping up, dam removals are some of the most complicated resources projects to permit because of all the things we talked about today, a lot of moving parts, a lot of considerations, a lot of stakeholders. But they're also some of the most rewarding projects that we permit, both from a social economic benefit standpoint, where we're eliminating hazards that might impact, human health and safety, natural resources, things like that, and providing a huge, typically a pretty big or huge ecosystem benefit of, that functional lift we talked about with the restoration of all the natural phenomena that occur in streams that were, cut off for the years the dam was in place. So some advice, some unsolicited advice, pre-application meetings are super useful. They can cut down the time and effort in the design and permitting process. So if we kind of go over concepts and talk about, some strategies that might help in these projects, that can eliminate the need for, design revisions and back and forth that cost time, money, and effort, and trying to get a acceptable design that can be permitted. We developed a document. I won't pull it up, but we are going to be circulating that very shortly, which is kind of a checklist or decision tree type document where you can go through, look at your project and see if these criteria would apply, and then engage with the right folks at the right time to make sure that all the documentation, the data collection and stuff occurs during the design process that will result in EGLE and other stakeholders having all the information that they need to be able to review and hopefully issue a permit for a dam removal at the end of the day, with a lot of delays and pauses and additional costs being incurred, if any of that information is inadequate or missing from the initial application. So that is, we'll share that. It's hopefully it'll be useful to you folks and that do design or involved with design for dam removal, and provide some level of guidance on what the expectations are when you're designing and permitting a dam removal project. But kind of a big takeaway too is sediment management and wetland impacts can greatly increase the complexity and cost of a project. So though much work on the front end can be done to kind of quantify how much sediment, what the sediment quality is, where that needs to go, where the wetlands are, where the wetlands will be, during the various phases of the project. Or early coordination with water resources division staff and understanding of what the requirements would be will greatly improve the outcome. So we encourage folks to reach out with questions, use the pre-application meeting process, get us some thoughts, on sediment sampling plans. We can provide input on that. Get us thought, ask us questions about, wetland delineation requirements and assessment of wetlands to remain. The more of that we can do on the front end, the less surprises there on the back end, and less time and effort it'll take, through the permitting process. So with that, I think I'm done. So we have about 10 minutes, so 11 minutes for questions and answer.
Thanks, Luke. So right now we have one question that I'll ask you and throw out there. But if other folks have questions, please type them in the Q&A and we'll go through them here with the remaining time we have. So this is a long one. If you want to pull up the Q&A, you might want to read it, but I'll read it aloud for everyone in case there's people in the car or whatever listening today. So much of the public, particularly amongst property owners and local government representatives around legacy dam impoundments, espouse that dam removal and reversion of impoundments to streams or rivers diminishes the value of properties around the impoundment. The claim is often made without any empirical data or other substantive evidence to support it, and in some cases is made in spite of evidence to the contrary. In your years as a professional dam safety engineer, have you experienced a dam removal that was demonstrated to significantly negatively impact impoundment property values or even local recreational economics in general? This perception seems like common fodder for those opposed to dam removals, yet actual evidence of diminished local property values is very uncommon.
So this is a fantastic question, and we could probably do another hour and a half just on this, but I'll keep it short. So yes, it's often a claim that's made that, and it's probably relevant in certain cases where, the impoundment is a largely developed recreational impoundment that, people bought those homes because they wanted lakefront property, right? So I will say that, in our research, on this issue, it's kind of a mixed bag. There have been studies that showed that property values were negatively impacted. There's been studies that show that property values were positively impacted, and there's probably to say that it says about the same. So it's really a mixed bag if you look up the studies that have been done on this issue. I think it has to do a lot with the quality of the impoundment. If it's a old mill pond that's choked off with sediment and nobody passes boats on it, that's one thing. But if it's, kind of a pristine recreational lake, that might be another scenario. So the law states, basically that the folks around an impoundment, have certain riparian or littoral rights that can't be severed, through an action, one of the actions. But it's generally if recreation, like in the form of navigation, hunting, fishing, things like that, swimming, are maintained by the stream, then there's no legal right for property owners to maintain a specific water level elevation. So the flip side of that coin is, it would become the responsibility of the dam owner in perpetuity to maintain a dam in a safe condition forever to subsidize those folks' property values, right? And which is also equally as unreasonable, right? So I see both sides. It's always an issue, especially if there's folks who live on the impoundment. Typically, unless there's a, desire from the folks around the impoundment to pay for long-term ongoing operation and maintenance of the dam, there's not, the dam removal will still go forward. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think you did good. So we just had like 5 questions come in, so you're going to have to do rapid fire
Rapid fire.
So, okay. And I'm actually going to help with a couple of them because some of them are more 301 or programmatic kind of questions. So the first one is, Does EGLE reach out to tribes about dam removal projects under review? The slide said to contact the EGLE tribal liaison early on, and I would request that EGLE staff contact the tribes based off areas, counties of interest, perhaps. So I think I'll start and then you can chime in, Luke. So I do think that we do contact the tribes based on areas and counties of interest. The reason why the note about contacting our tribal liaison is in Luke's presentation is because we really want our staff to be working with our tribal liaison when they do contact the tribes. So the first step is really to do some internal coordination and then reach out after that. So sorry if that was confusing, but that's sort of the first step in what happens internally with us in EGLE. Luke, do you want anything to add on that?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head. The only thing I'd add was that these slides were adapted from slides that I presented to staff. So that was kind of a confusion. We will typically engage with the tribal liaison to get the consultation started. And once we identify that that would be a concern. So yeah, it wouldn't be on the applicant to engage with the tribal liaison. Our staff would do that. So.
Okay. Next one is, does SHPO or do SHPO issues slow permitting process? Is there a way to get ahead of this? I think it really depends on the project and whether there are sort of historic issues or if there are potential archaeological concerns in the area. I think applicants could try to reach out to the State Historic Preservation Office, but typically they focus on federally funded projects. So if you do have like a federal grant or something, you might get feedback more easily if you do contact them. But we're gonna do that internally also on our end. If we have basically a screening process, if we think there are potential concerns, we'll be reaching out either to SHPO or to our historic and archaeological experts with the DNR. Do you have anything to add to that, Luke?
The only thing I'd add is, when a project uses federal funding and has to do a NEPA review, it seems that process takes a longer time because it's part of the whole NEPA review, which just takes a long time. I've actually had pretty good luck reaching out to the State Historic Preservation Office for a state, a state like a privately funded or, that doesn't require a NEPA review and get pretty good turnaround. But yeah, I mean, if there's issues, that can add time and complexity to any project. So early coordination and setting appropriate expectations for timeframe should be part of the consideration and try to engage early. So yeah.
Great. Can Luke show slide 60 of the Boardman Dam removal and explain what is going on there and say a little more on how long that took?
Okay, let me share. Oops. So I'm fumbling for the buttons now. So, all right. So go back to here. Slide 60. I'm just going to pull it up here. This is, there's a lot going on here. So this is the Boardman Dam removal as indicated. I can maybe start. Whoops, that was not what I wanted to do. I don't know how to start from now.
Now you're going to have to find it again.
I don't know. I can't find the button for start from existing slides. So sorry about this.
It looked
fine. Slide 60. So this is this is the earthen embankment and the original alignment of the Boardman River pre-dam construction. There was an off the picture to the towards us here would have been an excavated head race channel to the powerhouse. So folks are familiar, used to be the Cass Road that goes over top of the powerhouse, a one-lane bridge. So this was actually interesting. They built a bridge to nowhere of a dried up stream bed downstream to the right, on this project. And then they started to remove the dam, which kind of filled in the previous Cass Road bridge and widened it to two-lane highway. So, but this is specifically the black pipes are the siphons. So this are actively sucking water out siphoning water out of the impoundment to lower it in a controlled manner. There's at the end of the pipes are turned up to kind of reduce the velocity of the water coming out of the end of the pipes, and then there's a stilling basin to kind of capture any erosion or sediment transport that might be happening to slow that. While they're lowering the water level in the embankment, they're also cutting down the earthen embankment, and there's a concrete core wall along. I don't know if you guys can see my cursor, but along the center
Yep, we
line,
can.
where they were actually lowering the concrete core wall. And once the siphons got to as low as they could draw the water level, I think it was about 6 feet ahead left on the dam, they started to lower this core wall and utilize this constructed articulated concrete mat or concrete block mat channel and stilling basin to pass the remaining of the flow, cut down the rest of the embankment, restore the channel reach, and divert the flow back into the restored channel. So this took a long time because it was, I think, 20 feet or more of, so it was a couple months probably, to get this water level down just for this portion. And then the project took several months after that to do the complete restoration of the channel, the grading, the seeding, all that stuff. So hopefully that answers the question.
Nice. Thanks, Luke. There's a couple here I'm going to answer, I think. So someone said, thanks, Luke. Nice job. Some of the hurdles and complexities for removing dams that you stated seem a bit overwhelming. Other than getting involved early in planning, is EGLE working to do things legislatively or internally to make it easier to go through this process? So I think, as Luke pointed out, one of the reasons why these are complicated is there are a lot of different statutes and coordination that needs to happen. I think our perspective is those issues need to be looked at. So those reviews shouldn't be eliminated, but we are working on making that coordination process go as best as possible. And then we're also putting resources into this program to try to put the right amount of staffing into it. So we have Mason, who's now our grants and loans coordinator, but he's also kind of our lead on dam removals. We're trying to get additional funding for dam removals. We're, spending a lot more time on education and outreach on this. And then we're also looking at our internal processes and how we can make those better, either sort of procedurally or eliminating steps or, speeding things along. So do you have anything to add to that, Luke, or is that okay?
No, I think that's right. We're actively pursuing, funding to help out with some of these things, but recognizing that sediment management and wetlands protection and all the things that, can potentially be hurdles to these projects from a cost and complexity standpoint, it's probably best that we continue to do the same level of review to protect those resources, right? So it might just be kind of the cost of doing business. So we'll try to help with funding strategies to ensure that those things are being done.
Okay, you mentioned the SQT as part of 301 reviews. Would you consider this a requirement or recommendation? I guess my answer would be that's going to be based on the project, whether we would consider it recommended or required or maybe not needed at all. So I think that's probably the answer on that one. When were hazard labels placed on dams? Immediately after construction? Why are some FERC hydropower structures that back up large impoundments not considered high hazard, yet some small forested impoundments are considered high hazard?
So hazard potential is determined in the 90s when the statute went into place. So, I mean, all dams have a relative hazard since they're constructed, right? So they pose some level of hazard, but we developed the definitions in the statute of, the Public Act 300 in 1989, and then the Part 315 Dam Safety 1994 defined the hazard levels, kind of put the definitions into place. So that's when each were assigned a hazard potential, but it's based on the analysis of what the downstream hazards are. And it's defined in statute, but it basically says, even though there might be very, very significant flooding to the back of the middle of nowhere hydropower dam that's very huge and has a very huge impoundment, If it's just forest downstream, even though it's significant flooding, if significant environmental degradation or threat to human life or inhabited structures or roads or railways, all the things that are defined in statute aren't there, then it might be a low hazard dam, right? But consequently, conversely, if a dam is still out in a forested area, but there's a campground or a road or something downstream that puts people at risk, that could elevate it to a significant or high hazard. Just one potential or one likely loss elevates any dam to a high hazard. So where a threat to loss of life exists, it's a high hazard. Even if it's a smaller dam with a relatively smaller impoundment, if there's something critical downstream where a person could lose their life or would likely lose their life if the dam were to fail, that's a high hazard dam.
Okay, one more question, and then I think we should wrap it up because we're 5 minutes over at this point. How does EGLE handle removing dams with absentee owners or unresponsive bankrupt owners who refuse to pay to maintain their structure or remove it? Is the cost passed on to the public?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because that's a question I ask every day when we get non-response from dam owners or entities go bankrupt, or it's unclear who owns a dam, right? The orphan dams exist. So until recently, we didn't have a good answer. We could order the owner to do something, but if they were unresponsive and we couldn't compel them somehow, we didn't really have a good process in place for being able to handle that. It was no funding nor, but 2022, I believe, as part of the 22 budget, we did get a dam risk reduction emergency fund. I forget exactly what it's called in the statute, but an emergency fund, $6 million in a pot that the department can utilize if a dam emergency exists. So we've always had the authority to tell the owner to do something to mitigate risk of failure at their dam if it was imminent that failure would occur. It's called an emergency order under section 315.21 of part 315. But if the owner doesn't comply with that order, then the department has the authority to step in and do work at a dam to prevent failure, and then seek cost recovery from the owner through court action. So we've always had the authority. We just haven't had the means to be able to do something. So we do have a pot of money. We have the authority now. We are actively doing that at 2 dams right now, removing 2 dams that the dam owner just was unable to come up with a better solution. So we are doing that now. We have the ability to lower water levels behind dams to prevent failure, things like that. And then we definitely will seek cost recovery from the owner, but that's not a guarantee, right? So to answer the last part of that question, kind of the cost would be passed on to the public in that it was an appropriation from the legislature that funded that bill, but it's it funded that program. So yes, but hopefully we could seek some cost recovery from the owner to replenish those funds if the owner has the means or is able. We can convince the court to allow for that cost recovery.
Okay, thanks, Luke. And thank you for everyone for sticking around. I don't know, Nicole, if you have any parting words, but I appreciate you doing this, Luke.
No problem.
Yeah, thank you both, Luke and Amy. Folks, the next webinar is scheduled for September. Hopefully we'll see you then. Until then, thanks for tuning in today and have a nice rest of your day.